And this is, as I said, the fifth installment of the Leaving Canada Speaker Series, which is sponsored by Mennonite Heritage Village in Steinbach and the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg, with support from the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation. My name is Aileen Friesen. I am the Executive Director of the Plett Foundation, an Associate Professor at the University of Winnipeg, and Co-Director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, along with Dr. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen. And so we want to recognize that Mennonite Heritage Village and the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies are located on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Assiniboine Cree, Dakota, Dene, and the Métis Nation. And of course, when Mennonites arrived in the 1870s, they entered into this overwhelmingly Indigenous space, a land that was held sacred by these people. Tonight, we are here to listen to Royden Loewen, a notable historian of Mennonite transnational history and the former chair in Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg until his retirement in 2020. He is the author of many books on the history of Mennonites, several of them award-winning, including his latest book, Mennonite Farmers, A Global History of Place and Sustainability, which was published with Johns Hopkins Press in 2021. I could add much more to Dr. Loewen's introduction, but he is of humble Kleine Gemeinde roots, and we wouldn't want to embarrass him with worldly praise, which, as we Mennonites know, is fleeting. But today and tonight, we are very honored to have him revisit some of his former work from the exceptional book, and actually one of my personal favorites, Village Among Nations, Canadian Mennonites in the Transnational World. So Roy will speak for approximately 40 minutes, and then we will have time for questions. Please use the Q&A button to enter in your questions, and Roy will be happy to answer them after his lecture. So now please welcome Roy as he presents Mexico Mennonites Nostalgia for Old Canada.
Thank you, Aileen. Congratulations to the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg for this dynamic series and for engaging history and bringing it to the people. This is it's lovely to watch my successors at the University of Winnipeg, Ben and Aileen and Jeremy. So the topic at hand today is a topic that we oftentimes don't focus on when we ask about immigrant society. So, I mean, we teach our students in our Canadian schools about immigrants coming to Canada. They come here and they find a home, and it's as if this is a unilinear migration, and they have come to rest here. If you look at the topic of the centennial of the Mennonites who moved to Mexico and Paraguay in the 1920s, the word home actually appears quite often. H. Leonard Sawatsky's "They Sought a Homeland," which for decades was the authoritative sort of analysis of this migration. Martin Friesen's book about finding a home in the Paraguayan Chaco. So home appears here. But as Andrea Clausen, the senior curator at the Mennonite Heritage Village, reminded us at the last of these series, that when we think of immigrants, it is never merely a situation where they live in insular lives. So Andrea teased out for us the relationship that Mennonites in Mexico had with their Latino neighbors and Indigenous neighbors. And so what I want to do today is ask the question that we should ask about immigrants everywhere, because immigrants are never merely people who have made a migration or a move from one country to the other. They come with baggage, they come with nostalgias, they come with antipathies. The old homeland is always there. And no doubt more so today than ever before, given social media and the ease of electronic communications. But even back 100 years ago, this was the case. And so I want to focus on what Canada meant for the Mennonites in Mexico in particular. And if there's time, I can talk a little bit about Paraguay, but if we run out of time, I'll just save that for the Q&A if anybody wants to know something about the discovery there. Like Andrea, my main sort of source, and historians are always bound by the sources, but the source that I'm using is the Steinbach Post again, that lowly, newspaper from southeastern Manitoba, which suddenly crescendoed into this nexus of a transnational communication in the 1920s. And it is in those letters written into the diaspora from Mexico and from Paraguay that we find that Canada has obviously not disappeared from the landscape. So when I'm thinking about this, I wonder theoretically how to organize my thoughts around this cacophony of letters. And two words are shared by Eva Moroska, who's a U.S. historian who I first got to know many years ago as an historian of Jewish migrants to Pennsylvania. And possibly because they're Jews, they might have some similarity with Mennonites. And so she uses two German words to try to organize her thoughts organize the thoughts about that memory of the old homeland. And one is Heimat, Heimat, right? Homeland, or Heimat. No, Heimat is closer, right? Heimat evokes a local nostalgia for the bucolic and the idyllic and the things that are pure and almost become purer and lovelier over time. That's Heimat. Then she juxtaposes that to Vaterland, Vaterland, Fatherland. Now the Fatherland, she says, is oftentimes hostile, and it's a big governmental entity that is often behind pushing migrants, oftentimes from minorities in some respect, whether it's defined by class or ethnicity or religion, from their shores to another continent. And so Vaterland is the government entwined. And so Vaterland becomes more ambivalent. Vaterland is not necessarily one or the other. At least as I began thinking about it, it wasn't necessarily always bad. So the way I'm basically organizing my talk tonight is I'm going to focus a bit on just give you a sense of the cacophony of letters that are coming out and what they're saying about Canada, and just to prove that Canada is in their mindset. Secondly, I want to talk about Heimat. Thirdly, I want to talk about Vaterland in a good sense. There is a nostalgia for peace, order, and good government. And fourthly, Vaterland as bad, or Vaterland as hostile. And sort of organize my thoughts around those four subpoints. And yeah, I apologize. I'm too old school to use PowerPoint. And my favorite quip is, well-chosen word is worth 1,000 pictures. But you'll be the judge of that. And so I get maybe I also don't want to use PowerPoint because it's very difficult to actually capture nostalgia in photographs. But here's a sampling of the cacophonous sort of notes that come out of just reading the Steinbach Post. There is a kind of defensiveness and a understanding that you're writing to Canadians, whether directly or indirectly, and in the following examples, it's directly, with a understanding that the migration was costly and possibly not the smartest thing to do. So there's a letter from February 1934 by an anonymous writer to Lieber Big Bill, and he uses the English. So he has a friend out there, and he's just writing. He says, it's been 10 years since we arrived here, and you would not believe how much progress we have made and how beautiful Mexico is. And you know that this guy might be exaggerating things somewhat, because most letters don't actually deal with it in such overt terms. More typical is a letter from December 1931, where a writer says that Canadians may have heard it's dry here in Mexico. Well, at Jacob Weeb's last Tuesday, they butchered 2 pigs and had 2 pails of lard. And at Jacob Friesen's, they killed 3 pigs and had 3 pails of lard. So at least at these places, you couldn't say that it is dry. So it is like, okay, so things are tough in Mexico. We grant you that, but we're still getting along. Another a letter, this by an Abram Wolf, who is actually a regular correspondent to the Steinbach Post, writes in November 1934, and he also addresses it to a person. He says, Justina, you know, you should come to Mexico. And presumably it must be his sister or someone who's within the family for him to address her by her first name. We have Mexican weather here. So if in winter you need some sunshine, come to Mexico and enjoy the Mexican weather. And when you come, bring some chickens and some turkeys and some pork, because we still know how to eat German, he writes. So that it's like understood that Mexico might have good weather, but you know, the old peasant larder is somewhat thinner in Mexico than it was in Canada. So that's one set of letters where they're playful sometimes. Another set of letters is sometimes overtly hostile, especially in the 1930s. And I should have begun by saying, I'm going to focus on 1930 to 1945, that 15-year period. The 1930s especially, the Mennonites of Mexico begin taunting the Canadians over the word relief. And they use it in English. And it's like, you welfare bums, like you got relief in Canada. So there's a letter from May 1934. President Rodriguez has visited the Mennonite colonies and has reiterated Obregon's privilegium of 1921, ironically, just a year before the Mexican government closed the schools. And this writer says, we have our privilegium, you have your relief. Which would you rather have? Basically, would you rather have religious freedom, or would you like to have some basic handouts from the government? Another somewhat hostile one is with reference to in 1931-32, and Ben Lobseason will know this better than I do, but the Mexican government apparently closes its borders in retaliation to US immigration policy, and Canadian Mennonites who have meant to come to Mexico are stranded on the border, and in one case for up to 7 months before they return. The Mexican Mennonites are defensive about this. A couple of writers say, you know, yeah, Mexico did this in retaliation to the US. Mexico is not necessarily the bad person here. By the way, Canada has also closed its borders. And by the way, what caused the Mennonites particularly bad eye are 2 Canadian Mennonites, P.P. Clausen and Gerhard Hebert. Now I've got to get this right. Gerhard Hebert, yes. Hebert accuses Clausen of having smuggled Mennonites in without proper papers, and Clausen accuses Hebert of being a drunk. But the whole blame is now resided on Canadians. So that's a certain hostility. Now, within these 2 realms, and are these 2 words that I introduced earlier is Heimat and Vaterland, because I think that just to have gotten that taste of that, they do write about Canada and they have Canada on their minds at all times. If we focus first on the word Heimat, it's very easy to find Heimat type depictions, because Heimat denotes the again, that bucolic idyllic, and it's it's encased in travel logs. There is one travel log after the other. They come up some of like 4,000 words long, and they're absolutely amazing renditions where people, they transcend the United States. The United States is in between there, and they write. Some of them have a very mechanical perspective on this, writing with great precision about how many miles they traveled every single day, how many days it took, where they spent the nights, El Paso, El Dorado, Moorhead. They record this. They record when they start, when they stop. They record when a radiator fails and when a battery overheats. And it's always, and there's a great quip there. The towns of the American Midwest are beautiful, but our eyes are on our homeland, and they would travel. But where the homeland really comes out then is when they land in Canada. And again, this is whirlwind. There's an example from let me just see whether I can pull it. Gerhard Neufeld comes up. He travels up to Hague, Saskatchewan, then to Swift Current, Saskatchewan, then to Winnipeg, where he marvels at the sight of this bustling city that he remembers from 20 years earlier, and then down to Winkler, and finally to Hochfeld, our home. And there in the door was Hein and Zeus, the unmarried siblings who have maintained the home, so that they have come to roost. Now, amongst the Heimat letters, my favorite one is from Helena Thiessen from July 1945. It's 4,000 words long. And she talks about the emotions of arriving back home. And she says they went to Hein Claessens, and she doesn't say who they are. They must be sisters or whatever. She said, we got there a bit fast with time, and we were so excited to visit, we forgot to eat faspa, and by midnight we were still talking. Then she describes how at some juncture that evening, her niece, whom she hasn't seen since the niece was a girl, walks into the room and doesn't even know that her Aunt Helena and Uncle David are there, and she just shouts out, Uncle David and Tante Lina. Like it's like she knew intuitively who they were, even though no photograph had been taken of them. Or that they knew of. Helena talks about visiting the Buhlers. Again, must be another sister. She says, as we approached the house, my heart pounded so much that there was seemingly no room within the rib carriage to carry this heart any longer. And then she crescendos the whole thing with seeing her very mother in the doorway of the old house on the hill. And it's, you could weep along with Helena as she relives these moments. So lots of Heimat stuff, remembering the old homeland, and almost like this is 1945, right? This is 22 years after the migration that these images become sweeter as you age. Now, juxtapose that to Vaterland. So Vaterland is there as well. And Vaterland especially arises in the matrix of three events that impact the well-being of the Mennonites in Mexico. Again, Andrea talked about this in her talk, and that is the banditry, the thievery that the Mennonites experienced in Mexico they had not in Canada. Now, I mean, where poor people live right next to rich, well-to-do people, these things happen, right? But the particular sort of social context is Pancho Villa, the revolutionary who is an enemy of Obregón, is defeated. His spent forces are in the hills overlooking the Bastillas Valley in Chihuahua. They're hungry, and they make their ways down to the Mennonite villages at night and help themselves. And the first of a veritable sort of deluge of reports about thievery that I came upon occurred in November 1931. And first it's sort of prosaic. It's kind of humorous. The writer says that, you can get cheap labor from Mennonite. Mexicans are much cheaper to hire than Mennonites. But he says, seemingly at night, they come back for a second reckoning. There was a second accounting. They pay themselves bonuses by stealing from a piglet here or some chickens, etc. But the prosaic part becomes much more hostile over time, and it crescendos in a murder in February 1932. Heinrich Bandmann, who is a merchant, actually takes out a rifle and shoots after some of the thieves. The thieves return fire, and Heinrich is killed. And it's like, okay, now you have a death, and now you have real worry. And the debate now is, do we ask government for protection? Well, whether they ask for protection or not, the government does send out armed police officers or soldiers, whatever they are. The Schleimer Plus writers refer to them as Soldaten, who camp out at the Rubio, which those of you who've been in the Quotemoc area will know is just down the highway from Manitoba Colony. And by March 32, there's talk about the thieves are gone, and now we have beggars. But at least that little sort of event. But it was enough to frighten Mennonites. The second event is the closure of the second event is the mandatory registration and photograph of all immigrants. First word on March 12, 1932. Again, there's a wondering whether this is a very serious thing or is it just a rumor. And then it seems to crescendo again into something. Yeah, this is something to be worried about, and there is a fine if you do not do this, and a threat. In fact, it'll be bad for your bishops and your colony mayors if you advise your people against photography and registration. And by August 32, it seems that there's a certain acquiescence that this is just how it will be. The third thing, the third event, is the closure of the schools in May 1935. Again, a kind of a sort of at first wondering, is this a misunderstanding or is this a real thing? Our bishops and foresters have gone to Chihuahua City to investigate. They're going to go off to Mexico City if necessary. And then a month later, there's a letter. They have gone to Mexico City, and now there are letters that people are fearful and anxious because the very reason they came to Mexico seems to be taken away from them. And all that fall of 35, deep and profound worry. And in the winter of 36, the Mexican government blinks and opens the schools again. Now, three events that all begin generating discussion of returning to the Vaterland. And Canada is upheld suddenly as a model of peace, order, and good government. A letter from June 1935 from Abram Wolf, who says, he begins by saying, the letters that describe a green Canada. You're June, you have water, the trees are green, the grass is green. I can hardly stand living here in dry Mexico. And then he ups the ante. He says the reason for this longing is also because, and he actually uses the word return to the Vaterland, because order has broken down here in Mexico. And we hear, especially at places like Peace River, far away from the arms of these Anglo-conformist governments, where we yet might find peace. And this becomes a thing. December 1935, there's Isaac F. Dick writes about Mexico being the bad stepmother, and complains that we got 50% illiteracy here in this country, and now this country has closed our schools. So there's that complaint. And this is an event in Mennonite history. February 11th, 1936, an official delegation is sent from Mexico to Canada to investigate the possibilities of a mass return migration and to see whether the government would be willing to take back its stepchildren, if you will. Now, that's Vaterland in a kind of a positive sense, but there was a backlash to this, and it was Vaterland as hostile, and it comes from three sources. First, the first one I came upon was May 1935, right in the middle of this school question. Bernard Penner, who is a regular correspondent from out of Quadhemok area, writes that you want to go back to Canada? Well, Canada, he says, in 1935 is full of Bolsheviks and communists. Have you not heard about demonstrators in Regina, about the police shooting at demonstrators in Saskatoon, of Bolsheviks firing machine guns into the Parliament building in Ottawa? The louder thing I hadn't heard, but you know, news gains sort of momentum in time. So there's this place you don't want to go back to all those communists. You know, in the general strike of 1919, that's what Canada is, according to Bernard Penner. Then there's a letter, and I'm not sure who it is. It's almost as if it could be Schmiedehaus. He doesn't identify as a Mennonite. He comes out and now he gives a lesson in Mexican history, and he says Mexico is a socialist country that opened its arms for, and listen to this, isolated, pure German folk. Wow, blue-eyed. Mexican government loves Mennonites. Why would you possibly want to even return to Canada? And then he quotes an old colony bishop in a way that a non-Mennonite would quote the old colony bishop. And the old colony bishop is this: if it was right for us to leave Canada in 1922, it is not right for us to return in 1935, because nothing has changed in Canada. So the very strong defense, if you will, of Mexico underlaced with a further criticism of Canada. Then letters about, yes, it is bad in Mexico, but this is where our faith will be regenerated. And a couple of examples there. Abram B. Schmidt offers well, I was going to read it, but I think I'll just speak it. Offers a illustration about how God can bless you in Mexico. And he describes thieves breaking into the home of a Mennonite couple. And the couple overhears them plot. They will shoot the husband and they will rape the woman. And when the wife hears this, they accost the husband. The wife finds a moment and she escapes, and she runs to the neighboring house. And a single woman lives in that house, a widow or whoever, but only the woman is referenced. One of the thieves runs after the woman, catches up with her in that second house, and the woman of that second house turns to her sister in the faith and says, "We have no recourse. Let's fall to our knees and let us pray to God for help." And apparently when the thief sees the faith of these women, he becomes embarrassed and he turns and he flees. And Abram Schmidt's basic point is trust in God and things will be okay, even in this dysfunctional Mexico. There's another letter by a Cornelius Bandman from November 1936, where he says that if you would ask the typical Mexican Mennonite, are things better now in Mexico than are things better in Mexico in 1936 than they were in 1922? He says 90% would say it is worse. And everything that we possess, and 90% of what we possess, was purchased with Canadian dollars before we came here in 1922. But he says it doesn't matter. Here we have this privilegium, and we have faith. A third letter in this ilk is December 1936. Johann Knelson writes, "I remember now 1921 when Bishop A. Wiebe in Saskatchewan told us about the migration and how we would in fact suffer. And it is only by suffering that we would inherit the kingdom of God. And only by being wronged can you in fact become an inheritor of the kingdom. And he says, do you think it horrible to be stolen from or even murdered? Well, what did the martyrs do in the martyr's mirror? He says they suffered much more. So fellow Christian, have faith and understand that our lot is to suffer in Mexico, and it is okay. So the fever of migration to Canada dissipates with this sort of counterpunch, if you will, first based on the kind of the secular voices, and then based on the religious voices. So in a sense, that brings this lecture, in a sense, to an end. But as you know, Mennonites migrate and are migratory and diasporic people. And it's not difficult to find, even after the return to Canada fever has died away, there are just reams and reams of letters that speculate about where should we migrate. And I was going to refer to one that actually occurs. This is a letter written by J.J. Peters, April 1934. He writes, have you heard that Great Britain has gifted 2 islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to Australia? And I wonder what would have happened if 15 years ago, if we had gone to those 2 islands instead. We would have become fishermen or fishers. Just speculating, just asking. He's not suggesting that they move to, Fiji or whatever it is, but he's just wondering about how it would have been. He says, I'm not moving to these islands, but I'm happy to be here. He says in backwards Mexico, but it's just out of the blue. And example is June 1937. There's a letter. 2 men have gone to the U.S. To look for places to settle, and they're going to go to the Peace River to look for land. September 1937, a letter saying a delegation has gone to Quebec in Canada to see whether we can find religious freedom in Quebec, where the church runs schools. In March 1938, a veritable fever to move to South Dakota occurs, when real estate agents from South Dakota come to Mexico and say, guess what? The South Dakota government has 2 million acres of land that they want settlers for. And why would you even consider, Canada is giving you so much pain? Come to South Dakota instead. And this was like, there were multiple trips to South Dakota. And then there's a letter, March 1939. This guy, he goes all over the place. It's land tight here in Mexico. Has anybody heard anything from Africa? South Africa has land. Paraguay, are the Paraguayans talking? Is there land? Bolivia, I've heard of Bolivia. What do the Paraguayans say about Bolivia? And so these voices continue. But there's one voice that somehow takes the prominent voice here amongst the writers of this Heimat Plus, and that is that the decision to move to Mexico in 1922 was indeed worthwhile. And there's a writer who identifies as Frau Ginther, October 1945, and she recounts her life as a schoolgirl in Hague, Saskatchewan. And she says, I was such an excellent student. The school board recognized my gifts, and they pled with my father to send me to high school. And my father says, no, we need to go where our faith is leading us, and that is Mexico. And Frau Günther now, 23 years later, says, imagine if I had gone to high school, the old modest dresses would have disappeared. I would have melted into the world. My sons may well have joined the military. My daughters might well have mocked the old faith, and my grandchildren would not ever come to appreciate the simple rural life of Mexico. I am so grateful for my father to have turned down the invitation of the school board. So Canada is the Vaterland from which you came and found your faith established. I think I'll leave it at that, and can fill out some of the corners here if there are questions, and if there are not questions, I can just continue talking in some respect. But I'll shoot it over to you, Aileen.
Thank you, Roy, for that fascinating talk and for demonstrating that you don't need PowerPoint. You just need some good storytelling to keep everyone engaged and enthralled in your words. So that was a really wonderful way to end this series, but we haven't quite ended. We still have time for anyone in our audience to ask Roy some questions about this relationship of Mexico Mennonites to Canada and to other places, and how they envisioned these spaces and their relationship to them. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat, and then we can, or write them, sorry, in the question and answer. I have one in the chat. I'm going to read it, but for the rest of you, write them in the Q&A button. And so someone says, thank you, Mr. Loewen, Dr. Loewen, how familiar are you with the delegates who first traveled to Mexico to look for land? In particular, Benjamin Gertson from Hague. He was my great-grandfather.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I keep wondering how many. There's 122 folks who've tuned in, and I wonder, how many of them, find themselves within this story. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, a lot of specifics about the delegate. I think I probably did when I was writing Village Among Nations, but I do remember, poignantly, some of the events on that delegation, and I think I made reference to that at the museum, where Reverend Lepke from Saskatchewan, after the meeting Obregon in his palace, and they negotiate with Obregon, and he grabs Obregon's hand and says, "Thank you, Mr. President. You will be rewarded in eternity for your generosity." So a Mennonite minister saying to a Catholic war hero that he will be rewarded in heaven. And you get that sense when because there are quite a number of travel logs from the delegates who went, and the experiences they had along the way, and the openness they have to people of other descents. I mean, I remember again Lepke writing about how we were in Mexico and we traveled with all these brown people, and then suddenly we were in the US and we're traveling in better trains and surrounded by white people. He says, "I miss the Mexican trains." Anyway, just you could go on and on about those about the delegates and their experiences.
Okay, our next question is from Margaret, and she asks, how does the migration from Mexico and Paraguay in the past 30 years or so compare with the migration of the 30s?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because as you know, the back and forth, to and fro, never stops really. It obviously has dips, and it's very difficult to travel during World War II. And then again, as Ben's research of that drought in the 1950s sort of begins a big push for Mexican Mennonites in particular to return to Canada, albeit not to Western Canada, but to Ontario. So the migration in the 1920s to Mexico, of course, is actually relatively easy by migration standards, right? You take a train, you charter trains. Traveling to Paraguay is obviously much more arduous, right? You take a train to Montreal, and then you take the Vaterland down to Buenos Aires, and then trains and water vessels up to Puerto Quesada in the Chaco. Extremely difficult. And even then, I mean, up to 20% the Mennonites who moved to Chaco in 1926-27 returned to Canada. So, but when they returned, they're completely penniless because it's a very arduous trip. Now, compare that to just air travel. Like Paraguayans don't take ships back to Canada in the 1970s, 1980s, so that the ease with which you could return is so much easier. So once that 20% is over in Paraguay, there's my sense is, and some of you in the audience may know this better than me, very, very limited return from Paraguay then until travel eases, especially from Menno Colony. It's different for some of the Russlander people who were hoping to get to Canada in the first instance, and so they don't give up on Canada that easily. So it just air travel just completely revolutionizes the return from Paraguay, especially, and it's just the ease with which you can travel, across the U.S. now, with especially with their highway system, because crossing the border. I mean, we might complain about crossing the border now, but crossing the border in the 1920s was quite arduous. There's one of the travel logs explains how when you travel to Mexico, you got to cross the border at Gretna, show your papers, wait in line, get things stamped. Then you got to drive to, is it Nietzsche? That's just across this is the problem. I don't have an audience where people can nod and say, yes, it's Nietzsche, but whatever it is. And then we had to go into immigration offices there and stamp papers, etc. Then we have to get to El Paso, cross the American borders, but then at Juarez, they turned us back because the Mexicans didn't like the papers we had. We had to go and, telegraph Mexico City. So the borders were, I think, in many respects, more of a problem than now. There's just the ease of international travel has just completely revolutionized the story.
So Victor would like to know, did Mennonite nostalgia ever include the local Indigenous people?
You mean that you miss the local Indigenous people in Canada, I imagine. Actually, the letters that talk about, there's a couple letters from Paraguay that in fact compare the Enlit people of Chaco with the Indigenous people from presumably Rosa River. And of course, these are, oftentimes in very demeaning language, but there's a Paraguayan who says, yeah, we were hiring a lot of Enlit people who are Indiana, they just refer to them as Indiana, who are good laborers, unlike the Indians in Canada who do not like to work. And then another one, in another respect, says, the Indians here in Chaco, their appearance is quite different than the Indigenous back in Canada. Indigenous back in Canada had fearsome looks, whereas these have more passive looks, and so they do compare and contrast them. But I don't know nostalgia in terms of that they miss Indigenous neighbors or so on in Canada. I can't think of any, but these are references where you explicitly compare the Indigenous, especially in Paraguay and Canada.
So Linda would like you to elaborate on what happened when the official delegation sent from Mexico, the Bad Stepmother, came to Canada to see how a return migration would be received.
That's a really good question, because I actually don't know the answer. In fact, I was surprised. I didn't know about this delegation. It might be hidden away in Leonard Swatsky's They Sought a Homeland, or somebody in the audience knows about this. I didn't know that there was an official delegation, and I can't. And there was no word. At least I don't recall coming across a subsequent letter saying that that this delegation, had sought an audience with a particular person. I mean, we have more specifics about delegations that were sent from Manitoba to Quebec in the 1920s, and I think like up to half a dozen delegations were sent to Quebec. So that so where they were basically laughed out of the province. We Germans have come from Manitoba, and we want religious freedom in Quebec because we understand that in Quebec the church is allowed to run the school. So we like that idea. So we like the church to run the school and keep our German language. And they were told politely, somewhat impolitely, by Quebec officials that, well, no, our constitution or our laws are there to protect the Catholic Church and the French language, and we're not about to try to feather in Mennonites into this matrix. So I know more about that than I know about this delegation. I know that there are definitely letters saying that the Canadian fever is over, and that a number of people have sold their farms, ready to move to Canada, and then the schools open, and so then there's a change of mind. But the idea that you can get to Canada and get beyond the long arm of government by Peace River and La Crete, there's a continued fascination with that idea right through this time. And of course, that was in a sense the La Crete experiment was old colony people who didn't want to move to Mexico and risk all, deciding that if we go to Peace River and farther north, we're going to be away from the long arm of the Department of Education, Alberta. And in a sense, they were proved correctly, because the Alberta government, my understanding is, didn't really crack down on the old colony schools in La Crete until the late 1950s, which then generated another migration, including to Belize. So again, good question, but I'm speculating.
Speculation is always good. So I'm going to ask one of my own questions. In terms of this nostalgia with Canada, what role do you think the land played, or was it family? Like one of your examples was about seeing the family again, the siblings that didn't come to Mexico, or is it the buildings? Like, what can we kind of center this nostalgia in something? I'm just thinking about Mennonites traveling back to Ukraine and like touching the land and experiencing this sense of belonging and homeland. Is there any sense of that it's about the people, or is it about the actual physical land?
You would think it could be about land. I mean, the land that the Mennonites vacated in the Winkler area is prime agricultural land. I mean, it's what does it sell for? $15,000 an acre now. So that the folks who stayed behind and expanded their farms, became very well to do. But the old colony people definitely left a very rich agricultural hinterland and placed themselves in privation. This is without. I mean, I don't know of anybody. Any memoirs? I think actually Leonard Swatsky, I remember years ago, made an argument that the folks who resisted going to Mexico were oftentimes the middle-aged who had land and and so on. But just to say, I mean, that it is it's always people. I mean, there's this one guy who quips about Winnipeg. There's the bustling city that he remembers. It's still there. But it is specific people, and just the deep bond and the love that exists within these communities. And again, we often look upon the Mennonite colonies in Mexico like cerebrally. They have these problems, they have this drought and so on, but it's such strong sibling and parental bonds, and so it's those connections that I think commute the Heimat. I'm just thinking, I mean, you do have, I mean, I don't want to get all the geographers upset here, but I'm just thinking now, I mean, there's a guy who talks about, we went to our old house. And there in the room, there I saw the corner room where my cradle would have been at. So there's a spatial thing there for sure. Or the reference by Helena Thiessen, you know, the old house on the hill, and in the doorway stood the actual mother. So it is, you're still drawn to the person. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good response. Betty wants to know, so her history is embedded in this story that you've told, that her parents were born in Mexico in the early years, the late 1920s, early 1930s, and in 54 they moved to Canada with 5 children. Would you know how many Mennonites have returned to Canada over the years, or do you want to just maybe elaborate on this kind of back and forth migration that takes place during this period?
Oh, wow. And was this to Ontario, I imagine, maybe? I mean, by 1954, the first folks are beginning to get to southern Ontario. The back and forth, well, that's certainly a reality. I think it'd be very difficult to find a number. I know, I mean, years ago, we were already talking about 50,000 Mennonites from Mexico and southern Ontario alone. And then when do you know, at what point do you freeze the number? Because the back and forth continues. I mean, citizenship laws have changed now, so as to make it somewhat more difficult. But the sense that you can move so easily between 2 places. I mean, from oral history that we did amongst the, you know, these folks, it is often times where you, like, these are truly transnational people in that they use 2 countries to make things work. So that oftentimes you leave Bolivia or Mexico to come to Canada to earn the foundation of the money you need to buy land back in Latin America. And you might have to go back and forth a couple of times to do that. And children get shunted back and forth. I remember being in Durango, in Hague, Saskatchewan, or not, Mexico, sorry, Patos. And the empty houses, like reams of empty houses, and my co saying, well, they're all in Canada. They'll all come back at some point. So yeah, this is a phenomenon, and yeah, you can buy my book, Village Among Nations.
It's a great book. Yeah, anyone who's interested in this topic, please go out and get Village Among Nations. Carol wants to know about citizenship, and if you know at one point these migrants lose their citizenship, or how does citizenship work in this context?
Yeah, no, I'm not an expert on that. I know that the law keeps changing, and at some point, if your grandparents were born in Canada and you came to Canada sometime before you're 28, you could get Canadian citizenship, which is probably one of the most liberal citizenship laws on the face in the world. That of course has changed with Stephen Harper's government, I believe. But I'm not an expert on citizenship. But yeah, the laws have changed. But they were very. I mean, what aided this return migration in such immense numbers was certainly Canada's very liberal immigration laws. Tina Fair-Kaler is there. She can answer everything you want to know about citizenship.
This is why we have a webinar format, so that people from the audience can't jump in, because yeah, we have a lot of people who have certain types of knowledge, and Tina is one of them. And so if anyone has a last question, just type it in, because I will ask a question and then we'll have time for one more after that. And I'm curious about, so you're a person who has studied this migration, transnationalism within the Mennonite story to a large extent, and you've used a number of different types of sources. So one of the sources that you've featured today would be Die Steinbach Post. but you've also had oral interviews throughout your research career. Is there a difference? Do these different sources tell us something new about the migration? Like, how do these newspaper accounts compare to oral interviews? Is there something that the newspapers add to help us understand this nostalgia that maybe the interviews wouldn't allow us to investigate?
Yeah, because you're always so when as an historian you look at a source, you're always asking what's the source meant to do. So a newspaper is a public letter, right? It's not a private letter, so that many people will potentially be reading your letter, and so you often I think unconsciously or implicitly enter into a debate. And so that's why reading newspaper letters are fun in that respect, because there's lots of sort of undercurrents of stuff going on. Oftentimes, there's little pokes and jabs that you give people, or sometimes you become really hostile and write with overt opposition. So so it's different than a private letter. It's different than a diary, right? A diary you write for yourself. Oftentimes, you write a memoir for your family. There's lots of different kinds of sources, each one thinks of time and space in somewhat different ways.
Okay, and so that might be our final question of the evening. Thank you to Dr. Roy Loewen for being with us today and giving us that wonderful presentation. Remember that Leaving Canada, the Mennonite Migration to Mexico is on display at Mennonite Heritage Village until November 30th, and that this will end our Leaving Canada webinar series. And I would like to thank my co-organizer, Andrea Clausen, the Senior Curator at Mennonite Heritage Village. And thanks to the MHV staff for helping out with organizing this series, and Jeremy Weeb of the Plett Foundation, and Evan, who is taking care of all of our technical part of these presentations. So thanks to all of those people. And although we don't have any webinars planned in the future, you can look forward to the CTMS conference in July 2023, in which we will be investigating the Russlander Mennonites, War, Dislocation, and New Beginnings. And that will be July 14th to 15th at the University of Winnipeg in person, and also live streamed. And finally, you can rewatch this presentation on MHV or CTMS's YouTube channel. A link will be sent out to you. You can share it with your friends and be part of this ongoing discussion about leaving Canada. And so a number of our guests have thanked Dr. Loewen for his presentation. And so thank you once again, and everyone have a wonderful night.